The motivation for the paper is very simple. It is in the three facts at the top of the slide, which is if you look at the US today and you look at the 10-year nominal rate, it's 2.7%. It moves a bit every day these days, but within that range. If you look at the forecast of US nominal growth, it's about 2% real, 2% inflation, so about 4%, which means that the expected value of, I'm going to use R and G, R the safe rate and G the growth rate is minus 1.3%, so negative. The rate is expected to be below the growth rate by 1.3% annually. If you do this crossing the ocean, then the numbers are even more dramatic. So this is a very striking fact, the fact that the safe interest rate is lower than the growth rate and clearly anticipated to be so in expected value for a very long time. The policy motivation is as strong, and in particular it is very strong for me, which is how costly is public debt. There is a sense that public debt is incredibly costly, and you hear calls for dramatic decreases in public debt. The bottom line is, and this will be the conclusion, that the cost of debt is probably positive, but is substantially smaller than the current consensus. The implication of this is in the future we should probably revisit the fiscal rules that we're using. I want to discuss the benefits and the cost of debt, and that could be, a lecture by itself, but I want to make a few points. The first one on the benefits of debt. I've focused on the effect on steady-state utility in what I've shown you. But I've ignored the fact that in the first period, initially, debt was used for something. It gave utility to the old if it was a straight transfer or it did something useful. I didn't take this into account. If you have a social discount factor, which is 1, that's fine. You should be you're basically looking infinitely in the future, and only the steady state matters. But if you give more weight to current generations than future generations, then this is going to make the computation more favorable to debt than otherwise. The second, I think, is important in the current context, especially if we get back into a recession, which is debt issuance to reduce the output gap. So the argument has been made that if we are in a recession and the zero lower bound is binding, then we should use fiscal policy. We should basically use deficits in order to prop up demand. Now, that's a separate argument from the one I've given, but it complements my argument very much because it says you should do it. In addition, it's not very costly because this is exactly the type of environment where the interest rate is far below the potential growth rate, and therefore the cost of debt in that context may be very, very small. So there are two reasons basically to want aggressively to use fiscal policy when you're at the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound. Then obviously the third point goes without saying that if you use debt to finance public investment and the rate of return, the risk-adjusted rate of return on public investment is high, which I believe, then you should do it. To the costs, and I think there are three different arguments, probably some things that you've been thinking about as I was talking. The first one is I've assumed that the risk rate really reflects the preferences of individuals. It is really what people think is the risk-adjusted rate of return on capital. That may not be. And you have environments in which you have what's known as financial repression, in which you tell the banks, please hold the stuff, you have no choice, at a very low rate. In this case, clearly this is not reflecting preferences, it's reflecting a distortion, in which case you should be looking at another rate than the risk rate. Now, there is no such thing today as formal financial repression in the US, but there are liquidity ratios. Liquidity ratios have very good reasons for being there, but basically they lead banks to hold maybe more safe bonds or safe government bonds than they would like, and therefore there's a possibility that the safe rate is a bit lower than it would be otherwise. So that's something that has to be taken into account. I think the second reason is something that many of you have in mind, which is, well, okay, and the past is the past, but what about the future? How can we be sure? You've shown that in expected value it works, but maybe the safe rate will become higher than the growth rate again. This is the whole discussion of a secular stagnation. And you have my friend Larry Summers thinking that, well, that's going to be the case for structural reasons, and there are people who say, no, it may actually go away. Even if there's uncertainty, the US government can actually, at this stage, lock in, probably not the whole funding, but part of the funding, by issuing index bonds. What is the probability that growth, the average growth rate over the next 30 years, will be less than 1%? I think it's very small. The other is, even if this is going to last maybe for 10 or 20 years, but not forever, then it's still the case that if you issue debt today and you don't repay it, when time comes to actually pay more, the debt to GDP ratio will be lower than it would have been otherwise, and therefore the burden of debt will be lower. The last point may be the most difficult one to handle. It's probably not very relevant for the US, although given the way policy is going, it might become, which is, I've been looking at the good equilibrium, basically. Investors look, they are willing to lend at the safe rate, the government doesn't have to raise taxes, therefore there's no reason to think that there's going to be default, and therefore it's safe. Now there's another equilibrium, typically, in which the investors, for whatever reason, think that, well, it's risky, ask for a spread, a risk spread, and then it makes it risky, because then the rate that the government has to pay is greater than the growth rate, and it may not be able to pay it. So how do we handle that? Namely, the only way you can eliminate multiple equilibria is by having levels of debt which are so low that no matter what, the government will be able to pay the safe rate. And this happens at much lower debt levels than anything that we can hope to get to in the short or the medium run. So I think this issue of multiplicity is a relevant one, but it should not be handled by trying to reduce the debt by 1 or 2% a year if it's costly in terms of output. It has to be handled in other ways. I discuss it in the paper, longer maturity, or a contingent rule in which you respond if investors start increasing interest rate, you increase the primary surplus. What do I want you to go away with? Not the notion that debt is good, but that may not be so bad.